Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world today. We see the United States' power and influence has declined significantly. We see the rise of China, and I have a great guest coming on. I have Gordon Chang out with a brand new book, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Gordon, welcome to the PAS Report. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. And thank you, Nicholas.
Well, I'm glad you could join me because as of right now, you have a lot on Democrat side and the left saying that Russia is America's biggest adversary out there. But realistically, it's China. They're the one that compete with us most. In your book, Plan Red, you explain how Xi Jinping believes he has to destroy America in order to achieve China's objectives. Can you elaborate for the audience what China's objectives are?
China's Xi Jinping believes that he is the world's only legitimate ruler. And by implication, that means the United States is not sovereign, that we're just a colony. Throughout this century, he has been trying to impose China's imperial era system, where Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven to rule what they call Tianxia, or all under heaven, but that heaven actually compelled them to do so. And since 2017, Chinese officials have been publicly talking about the moon and Mars as sovereign Chinese territory. That's right, part of the People's Republic of China. Now, this is ludicrous, but the point is, this is what the Chinese have been saying. And we Americans, because we're Americans, believe that we're entitled to ignore what our enemies say. So, for instance, we ignored Osama bin Laden until one day when he reached out and killed 2,977 of us. So we should be listening to what the Chinese are saying, even if it is just totally lunatic.
Yeah, I think that's important. You always listen to the words, particularly of the adversaries, because they understand the dynamics of international politics. And you have China that wants to challenge our hegemony. And when you look at these foreign leaders, a lot of times they mean what they say. They understand if they say things that don't follow through, it's going to weaken them in the long run. But it's not just their words, it's also their actions. And you lay out how China has taken preparations to achieve these goals and objectives, correct?
Yes, what we see is China's unrestricted warfare, as they call it, which is they've declared a people's war on us. Now, this was People's Daily in May 2019 in a landmark editorial. And in case we were unclear about what a people's war is, because it is a defined term and important in Communist Party thought, last year, PLA Daily, which is an official website of the Chinese military, actually said people's war is total war, and they explained total war. So we should not be left in any doubt as to what they're talking about. So for instance, fentanyl. Fentanyl is not just the activity of some Chinese criminal gangs. This is in China's total surveillance state. The regime knows and approves of what these fentanyl producers are doing. Some of them are even state-owned. We know that Chinese diplomats give cover to the gangs. Every container, it is inspected by Chinese officials. The fentanyl producers and gangs, they launder their money through the Chinese state banking system. China's TikTok, which it uses to propagate its narratives, promotes illicit drug use in the U.S. That's 75,000 Americans each year die from doses of illicit Chinese fentanyl. So we have to understand that they're taking lives. But it's more than just that, of course. You know, we see China stealing $500 billion of U.S. intellectual property each year. The list goes on and on what China has been doing to weaken and take down the United States. One more point. China's regime believes it is in an existential struggle with us. And it's not because of anything that we say or do, Nicholas. It's because of who we are. You have an insecure regime in Beijing is worried about the inspirational impact of our values and form of governance on the Chinese people. So we will never have amicable relations with China as long as the Communist Party rules it. And according to the Communist Party, there's only going to be one survivor. It's either going to be the United States of America or the People's Republic of China, not both. And although China is a far weaker society than we are, they can actually take us down because they're attacking us and we're not defending ourselves.
That's such a great point. One of the things that really alarms me, under the Trump administration, you had about 200 Chinese nationals crossing the border each month. Under the Biden administration, that number has grown to 20,000 individuals a month, Chinese nationals. Now, anyone that knows anything about China knows about the social credit system, where you can't leave that country without the communist government's approval. You're not allowed to get passports or anything. Is China sending these people our way intentionally? Who are these people? Are they part of a criminal element? Is it part of the intelligence apparatus? Is it a combination? What's going on with that right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of different groups. Some of them, and especially if we go back 2 years ago, we were seeing primarily family groups coming across our border, and most of those people were who they say they were. They were just desperate to live in a free society. But that composition has changed, and now at least 2/3, and at some border entry points, 80 to 85% of them are single males of military age, traveling without family members. Some of them pretending not to speak English. U.S. Border Patrol knows that some of them have links to the Chinese military, and they're coming across in packs of 5 to 15. Now, this is occurring at the same time that we're seeing an increased tempo of incursions by Chinese nationals onto our military bases. Last month, at a U.S. nuclear weapons site, a Chinese national tried to gain entry with a Canadian passport. And the list of Chinese nationals doing this goes back about 3 or 4 years at a very fast pace. Basically, they're planning to attack our military facilities. And we have a government that is not paying attention. So, for instance, that guy who tried to get onto that nuclear weapons site, it was catch and release. He should have been held in a military brig indefinitely.
Yeah, it certainly should have. And that's where we routinely see governments dropping the ball, because China's campaign against America, it's a mostly multifaceted approach. So you have economic, you have political, you have criminal elements. They're buying up farmland. As you said, I mean, these farmlands are usually close to military bases. Could you elaborate on how China uses America's laws almost against us, how they're trying to carry out their goals within American society, and what institutions in America have been mostly compromised?
Well, every institution has been compromised. We're talking governments, businesses, universities, think tanks, media outlets. You mentioned farm and ranch land. We know, for instance, that in certain cases, Chinese state enterprises have bought land near U.S. military facilities. The most infamous of those instances was Grand Forks Air Force Base, where a Chinese food processor from Shandong province tried to buy land 12 miles from a site where we control our drones and have important uplink facilities to satellites. But it's more than just that. We know that the Chinese triads are establishing themselves on farmland. Oklahoma is ground zero. Chinese parties have illegal marijuana grows there, as they do in, for instance, places like Maine. But also in Oklahoma, they're basing human trafficking operations on farmland. So this has gone just beyond regular crime. And we're not doing very much about it. Remember, no American can own a square inch of land in China. And yet we're allowing them to buy up vast tracts of land and using them in some cases for illicit purposes. So this is something that's got to change immediately.
Yeah, it does. And our administration continues to fail. I mean, if an American company wants to do business in China, they have to sell half 50% to a Chinese company to partner up with, yet they get to do whatever they want here. And China has the most sophisticated espionage apparatus on the entire planet. Do you think that's an accurate statement that I say that about their intelligence apparatus?
It is definitely the most extensive and largest, and I could very well be the most sophisticated. We have very little in the way of intelligence apparatus in China. So there is this mismatch here. You know, we allow Chinese consular and Ministry of State Security agents to roam our country. And we allow them to try to get involved in political issues, stirring up demonstrations, as we know that the Los Angeles and the San Francisco consulates did when Xi Jinping came to California last November. Chinese consular officials were involved in fomenting violence on our streets. And why the San Francisco and Los Angeles consulates are still open, I have no idea, but they should have been closed immediately, just as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the Trump administration closed Houston. And Houston was not involved probably in nearly the same degree as those two California consulates.
Yeah, and it was interesting because when Xi Jinping did visit the United States, it was amazing how quickly Gavin Newsom was able to get rid of all the homeless people on the streets. It shows. But when we look back at the start of the Biden administration, Chinese officials met with Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan over in Alaska, and Chinese officials began to lambast the United States, saying, calling out our human rights record and racism and discrimination. Do you think that at that meeting, China realized how weak and feckless this administration was?
They probably did it before then because they came in with scripts, but clearly afterwards they realized that because you had China's two top diplomats at the time, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, berated Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan. And they were, our guys were silent, basically. What Sullivan and Blinken should have done was ended the meeting right there. But what China did afterwards, it went on an extended propaganda blitz to highlight Yang's comments. And clearly what they were using that is to try to show the United States to be incapable. And by the way, that was the beginning of a series of propaganda blasts against the United States in 2021. We had no clue what they were doing because we weren't paying attention to what they were saying. But the most important statement was from Yang Jiechi, who said, look, the U.S. is no longer in a position to talk to China from a position of strength. Well, yes, we are, or were. But the Biden administration's response to China has been feeble. As they attack us, the Biden administration tries to talk and it issues hollow warnings. And as we know, hollow warnings lead to war. And we have seen in the Biden administration the world go to war in Ukraine, in North Africa, and of course, in the Middle East.
Yeah, and currently you have China running a blockade on Taiwan as a military drill, but really it's preparation. Who do you think China wants to win the presidency? Do you think they would rather deal with a President Harris or a President Trump?
In 2020, it was clear they wanted Biden because they supported him in the Democratic Party primaries over Bernie Sanders, and they supported Biden over Trump in the general election. This time, after warnings from the Biden administration, they've been a little bit more subtle, but we can see that they do want Harris over Trump from a number of different indications. And there are a couple of reasons for that, Nicholas. One of them is that every new American president gives the Chinese a grace period. And Trump has already been president. The grace period under Trump would be a lot smaller than the one that Harris will give, especially because Harris has a guy named Tim Walz, who's his vice president, who looks like a communist sympathizer. But the other thing about Trump, and that is China knows how to deal with hostile American presidents. So they don't care so much about the hostility. They can deal with it. What they can't deal with is they can't deal with Trump. And they can't deal with Trump because he's unpredictable. Trump set the tone for U.S.-China relations in April 2017 when Xi Jinping went to Mar-a-Lago. And over that most beautiful piece of chocolate cake, if you remember, Trump stood up and said, I've just ordered a missile strike on Syria. Syria being a Chinese friend, Xi Jinping was quiet. And although he's an aggressive guy, he was relatively well behaved for the 4 years of the Trump administration because he just did not know how to deal with Trump. So I'm sure that what they're looking at in Beijing is they're hoping for a Harris victory.
Yeah, well, I mean, under President Trump, it was the first time that China actually seriously got involved in North Korea because Trump spoke the language. He pointed to the television screen when the Syrian airstrikes were happening and said, "You don't want this right next door, so let's talk business here." And it seemed that Xi Jinping it put him back a little bit. Now, Xi Jinping, in your book, you made comparisons to Mao Zedong. What are the comparisons between the two leaders?
They both believe in a state-dominated country. Xi Jinping doesn't want foreign institutions in his country. Mao Zedong closed China off from the world. Well, Xi Jinping is doing the same thing in slower motion because Xi is not as powerful as Mao, but he's doing it nonetheless. But he's also emulating Xi Jinping in foreign policy. And I think that Xi has taken 2 pages out of Mao's peasant movement playbook. One of them is to encircle the cities from the countryside. And I think that he believes that Ukraine, North Africa, Israel are countryside, and we are the city. But the other thing is more important, and that involves the fomenting of chaos. Mao Zedong in 1966 wrote to his wife, John Ching, quote, "Great chaos under heaven achieves great order under heaven." Great order under heaven in Mao's lingo was worldwide Chinese rule. And so I think Xi Jinping believes that the disruption of the international system, in other words, war, will lead to his eventual complete control of humanity. And we do not understand that. We think that China wants peace like we do. No, they don't. They want to take down the international system and they want to institute in its place worldwide Chinese rule, not control, not hegemony, but worldwide Chinese direct rule.
Yeah, and they understand how to do it. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative was a brilliant policy strategically looking at. You lend broke countries money and you make them hire Chinese contractors to build out infrastructure. And when you can't pay those loans back, China controls the infrastructure in these countries and basically removes all sovereignty from those countries. So it was a brilliant strategy. But one of the things that has me really concerned, when Nixon first opened the door to China, the theory amongst American politicians was that China was going to become more like the United States, that elements of freedom and liberty in China would begin to open up. But it turns out our country has become a lot more like China when it comes to attacks on free speech and censorship and the build out of a government apparatus to target political opponents. What do you think is going on in the United States, and why do you think there's so many? I mean, I'll give you one example from an article from The Atlantic. You had Jack Goldsmith, Harvard law professor, Andrew Keen, Arizona University law professor, that wrote, in the era of the internet, China has largely gotten it right when it comes to the internet, and the United States has gotten it wrong. And we need to adopt a more Chinese style approach to the internet. What are your thoughts when you hear something like that?
I got news for those guys. The First Amendment to the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech, and the First Amendment is under attack. And it's under attack from many on the left, but especially there's a guy named Tim Walz who went on MSNBC and talked about how nobody has a right to spread disinformation. So clearly, what we've got right now is a problem. And the Biden administration was working with the big media platforms to censor views. Now, big media platforms, they have a First Amendment right to do whatever they want. So they can censor on their own. But the government, when it works with those media platforms to censor, that is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And we need to guard against it because we have half the country doesn't remember what are the amendments to our Constitution, the Bill of Rights.
No, I could argue it's a lot more than half the country. Sadly, unfortunately, we have a failed education system that most Americans are completely unaware of our Constitution and the fact that it's extraordinarily unique in the world because it limits government power. It doesn't dictate what we can and cannot do. It dictates what government can and cannot do. And I think that's an important component. But when it comes to China, what are the immediate actions that the United States should be taking right now in order to blunt the growing power and influence of China?
There's so many things. Basically, we should be doing the opposite of what we're doing across the board. So if we take a look at China's aggressive actions in East Asia, we should be making it very clear. The United States will defend our allies and our friends, such as Taiwan. If we were to do that, Xi Jinping would not think of invading Taiwan because even if he thinks he can take Taiwan, and he probably thinks that way, though I think he's wrong, but even if he thinks that way, he is not going to want to risk the casualties to do so, because the Communist Party is extremely casualty averse. So we need to be very clear in what we will do and to back up our words. Biden's been issuing a lot of hollow warnings to China. As we know, in the late 1930s with Britain and France and the Third Reich, hollow warnings lead to war. On the other aspects, though, we need to be severing trade, investment, technical cooperation, because we should not be aiding a regime that is planning to kill Americans. It's as simple as that. And we know that the Chinese economy right now is in a grim position. It's not growing at the 4.7% pace that they claim for the second quarter. It's probably about zero, could even be contracting. But even if it were growing at 4.7, it would not be growing fast enough to be able to create the output to retire debt, because China's having its 2008. We should be taking advantage of this situation to end communism in China. And I know a lot of people will think that that's impractical, but we can do it because right now, China is in a situation where they can't deal with their problems. They got simultaneous crises. Xi Jinping is leading them in the wrong direction back to Maoism, and the country is in dire straits.
And realistically, they need about double-digit growth for the next decade or two in order to really overtake the world economy. One of the things that has always fascinated me for the last couple of decades is the fact that the World Trade Organization still has China classified as a developing nation. If we push so that China is classified as a first world nation, how does that change the dynamics?
Trade is absolutely critical to Xi Jinping. Everyone has told him the only sustainable basis for the Chinese economy is consumption. Xi Jinping does not want to encourage consumption for a lot of reasons. So he has doubled down on exports as a way to rescue the Chinese economy. That means he needs open access, not only to the United States and the European Union, but the global South. And countries around the world are starting to close their markets to China. So anything that restricts or inhibits China's ability to sell goods abroad is going to be fatal for the Communist Party. And we ought to take advantage of that. Just one other thing, and that is the Tariff Act of 1930 prohibits the importation into the U.S. of goods made with forced labor. Many of Chinese goods, not just goods made by Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic minorities, but many of their goods are made with forced labor. We should not be allowing them into the stream of commerce in the United States. We do that, we can probably end communism in China very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, China has a 1.3 billion person population that it has to manage. And if it can't feed and employ that population, it's going to be a disaster for the communist regime. Do you think the Trump administration would start taking these actions to try and blunt Chinese power?
I think so. If you listen to what President Trump has been saying on the campaign trail, he's been talking about increased tariffs at a level that would basically cut off the American market to China. And he's been talking about other things as well. You know, Harris, she has sort of just gone along with everything Biden has done, which is sort of mild policies. Biden has done some things that the Chinese don't like, but he's done them very late in his administration, which indicates that they are campaign motivated. And that's not what we need. We need somebody who is willing to protect our country from China. And right now, Biden doesn't have that mindset. You know, to go back to your earlier question about Harris versus Trump, the one thing about Trump that really distinguishes him, not only from Harris, but for every other politician in the United States, is that he broke the engagement policy. And that policy was in place for 5 decades before Trump took the oath of office. And Trump is basically saying, look, I want good relations with China, but I'm putting American interests first. I'm not putting the interests of the Communist Party ahead of those of the United States of America. And while we might think that that's common sense and obviously something you should do, we've had a series of presidents, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, who have effectively put the interests of a communist superstate above those of the American worker, American people, and the American nation.
Yeah, and that's why everyone needs to check out Plan Red, China's project to destroy America. Gordon, always enjoy the conversation with you, and we'll put the book up at the website, link it to your website as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Nicholas. I really appreciated it.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.